So this is chapter 6, which focuses on the self and others. So awareness of the self is differentiated from other people and is crucial for children's development. There's a couple of different kinds of self. So the individual self is aspects of the self that make a person unique and separate from others. The relational self has to do with how we see ourselves in connection to other people, and that combination kind of how our relationships with other people influences who we are and how we see ourselves. There's the collective self, which is a person's concept of where they stand in a group, and so how they identify themselves based on their groups. So babies as young as 18 weeks of age become interested in their own reflections in a mirror, but they don't necessarily realize that they're looking at themselves. So we really think of this as happening when kids pass what we call the Rouge test, or sometimes this is called the mirror self-recognition test. And so this happens by around age 2. I've posted a video of this on Moodle so you can see what the full test looks like, but basically you put a spot of blush or something on a child's forehead and have them look in a mirror. And when they pass the mirror self-recognition test, they touch their own forehead instead of touching the forehead of the child on the mirror. Okay, another ways that we can conceptualize the self is by our self-description, so how we describe ourselves. So this starts around 3 to 4 years old with kind of observable physical features, preferences, social characteristics, things like this. By 5 to 7 year old, we get kind of competencies, so things that kids are actually good at. 8 to 10, they get a little more complex, so they can focus on abilities and interpersonal attributes. And in early adolescence, kids really start to be able to describe their interpersonal attributes as well, their social skills, emotions, things like that. And they can recognize that they have different selves in different contexts, so there are different areas where they are good or bad. Mid-adolescence, you start seeing kind of introspective and they become very preoccupied with other people think of them, and they really start to question their self-descriptions, especially when there are contradictions. And so in middle adolescence, they really become very aware of this. In late adolescence, they emphasize a lot of their personal beliefs and values, and they're also doing a lot of thinking of what might I be, what might my future self be. And so a big important component of the self is the self-esteem, which is how you evaluate yourself. So this is the evaluative component of the self, and it's about how positively or negatively we see ourselves. And so as kids start to understand more about themselves, they start to evaluate these qualities as good or bad. And there's certainly kind of a dark side. So in general, kids who have high self-esteem view themselves as competent and capable and are pleased with who they are, and they seem to be happier. We know that high self-esteem in childhood is linked to more positive adjustment, including school success and good relationships with parents. But there are dark sides as well, as I mentioned. So kids who have very high self-esteem might also be more daring in terms of experimentation, sexual activity, drinking, things like that. And high self-esteem can also be related to prejudice and antisocial behavior. We'll talk a little bit about prejudice and discrimination towards the end of this chapter. So promoting kind of universal high self-esteem could potentially have some pitfalls. And these global appraisals of ourselves as positive or negative, that's self-esteem, really are based on our strengths and weaknesses in different domains. So it's not just a global evaluation, but we actually have several subdomains. So there's scholastic competence, so how well you do academically, how well accepted you are by your peers, athletic competence, physical appearance and attractiveness, and then behavioral conduct as well. And so this is a picture of what a scale measuring this. So this is developed by Harder, and this is the self-perception profile scale for children. The first one is just an example, but you can see that basically it asks kids to choose whether they're more like a child with high self-esteem or low self-esteem. So for example, some kids feel like they're very good at their schoolwork, but other kids worry about whether they can do the work assigned to them. So it's getting at that scholastic one. Some kids find it hard to make friends, but other kids find it's pretty easy to make friends, getting at social acceptance. And so you can kind of look this over and see how we might assess kids' self-concept and self-worth with regard to these different subdomains. In terms of how kids learn this self-appraisal, generally young kids start out with kind of unrealistically positive self-appraisals. They, under the age of 8, they just generally think that they are awesome. They have this positive rating bias where they really want to be, how good they are at something they rate based on how much they like it, not how their actual skill. So young kids tend to have this inflated sense of self-esteem, but both how they rate themselves and how they perceive themselves is important. As they get older, these self-appraisals become more realistic when they start to incorporate feedback from other people. And generally, kids start to distinguish among different kinds of competence. And so they start to be able to say, yes, I'm really good at physical activity, but I'm not so good at academic skills. There are some gender differences. So girls generally have lower global self-esteem than boys starting in about middle childhood, and these differences become even bigger in adolescence. There's a number of reasons. So boys are more dominant and assertive than girls, which could, these feelings of kind of power and influence may be part of the reason why boys have higher self-esteem. They also tend to engage in athletics more frequently. And also there are different kind of social standards for physical appearance. And so this may lead to different feelings and self-appraisals based on whether boys or girls are meeting these physical standards. There's also social factors that can really influence this. So for example, parents. Children with high self-esteem tend to have supportive parents that set clear standards and use these same kind of universal standards. And part of the way this works is parents kind of constructed a working model. So parents who are accepting and affectionate with their children, who set clear rules and use non-coercive discipline tactics, have kids who do better and have more positive self-appraisals. But peers can also play a role. So peers become increasingly influential kind of across development. As we've already talked about, as we hit adolescence, peers become more and more important. And part of the reason is that kids start going through this process of social comparison where they're really defining themselves and evaluating themselves based on other people's judgments. There's often kind of a thought that, okay, well, if self-esteem is good and has these positive effects, then we should all just praise our children and make them feel amazing all the time. But what can happen is that praising kids for their talent or intelligence often has negative relationships with success. So it leads them to expect to be automatically good at everything, and they struggle when they're not. So they get frustrated if they've been told they're smart all their lives. They struggle when they encounter a situation which they might struggle with a situation, then that might make it more difficult for them. So evidence really suggests that it's actually better to kind of foster what's called a growth mindset for kids, where we encourage them, tell them they're doing a good job trying, and the goal is to learn and get better, rather than telling them immediately, you're the best and you're great at this. So fostering that kind of growth mindset can make a really big difference. Okay, change of topic, we're going to shift to identity formation. When we talk about our identity formation, we're talking about normally getting into adolescence. We're asking a more sophisticated question than just early self-concept. Are you good or bad? Or even are you good or bad in different domains? Identity is really kind of a definition of oneself as kind of a discrete, separate entity. Who are you? And this idea to look at identity formation was really started by Erikson. And so if you remember Erikson's stages of development, he argued that kind of the big hurdle in adolescent development is this conflict between identity achievement and identity confusion. And so we have these different identities. We have a religious identity, a career identity, political identity, and it helps kind of tell us where we fit into society. So James Marcia looked at the process of identity formation of these different kinds of identities by exploring how much exploration adolescents had done and how much commitment they had made. And so it leads us to these kind of 4 different identity statuses. Across the top, we have whether people have low commitment or high commitment to a given identity. And then on the other side, we have the level of exploration. So have people engaged in very little exploration or very high levels of exploration. So if we take these one by one, identity diffusion status are people who have not engaged in a lot of exploration and who have not made a commitment. So this might be an adult who, or an emerging adult who says, I haven't really thought about religion and I don't know what religion I belong to. In contrast, foreclosure is low exploration but high commitment. So this might be someone saying, well, I'm a Baptist because my parents were Baptists and I just know. They haven't done any exploration on their own, but they have made a commitment to this identity. For moratorium, we've got low commitment but high exploration. So this is someone who is currently exploring their options but hasn't made a commitment yet. So I'm attending different religious services and trying to figure out which one fits me best. I'm doing the exploration, but I haven't made a commitment yet. And then identity achievement is someone who has made a commitment and engaged in a good amount of exploration. So I went to several different types of religious services. I've talked to a lot of clergy, and I've really decided that this is the religion that fits me best. So generally what we find is people start out in identity diffusion and foreclosure, they go to moratorium, and then they go to identity achievement, normally by the late teens to early 20s, although this is not a fixed sequence. Okay, so the way Marcia figured this out was through structured interviews. So he used these interviews to kind of classify people in their identity status based on whether they'd done exploration and whether they'd made a commitment. So he generally found that students who had achieved identity, so they'd done the exploration and made a commitment, it was associated with high self-esteem, they were more mature in terms of their reasoning, had clearer goals, and better achievement. People who were in foreclosure, so who had made a commitment without doing the exploration, they were more authoritarian, they were less flexible, they tended to be more subject to kind of extreme ideologies like cults and things like that. Identity moratorium, so these are people who are currently exploring different identity options but haven't made made a commitment. These people tend to be more anxious and maybe intense. Sometimes they have kind of strained relationships with the people around them as they're trying to figure out where they fit. But generally they're better adjusted than foreclosed or diffused statuses. And then finally, identity diffusion. These are viewed as kind of the least mature. So these are people who haven't explored and they haven't made a commitment. So in terms of what influences identity development, puberty is important because it kind of signals a break from childhood. And so often this kind of prompts awareness of themselves as an adult. If we talk about sexual identity, this prompts awareness of themselves as a sexual being, which can be kind of a trigger for this exploration. Also, if we think about cognitive development, there's a lot of changes in cognitive functioning. And so adolescents are able to think more abstractly and kind of recognize themselves in different contexts, and that can make a very big difference. Okay, in terms of the developmental trends, this figure shows the age of the subjects along the x-axis, and the y-axis is kind of the percentage of subjects in each status. So if we look at ages 12 and 15, most are in identity diffusion. They haven't even thought about their identity. We've got some in foreclosure. But as we kind of hit the late teens and early 20s, we really see more and more students who are reaching identity achievement or are engaging in moratorium. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of the identity statuses we've used as examples are are things that are universal, but we go through the same steps in terms of our ethnic identity. But this may be more salient for some individuals than others. But the ethnic identity is a sense of belonging to an ethnic group and a commitment to oneself, or committing oneself to that group's traditions or cultures. So we go through the same steps of ethnic identity as we would vocational or religious identity, the same processes of exploration and commitment. Identity achievement in terms of ethnic identity is generally associated with higher self-esteem and academic adjustment, better peer relations and peer assessment. So it's associated with positive things. But there are a number of stressors kind of associated with being a minority that can really kind of bring up this question potentially earlier on. Sometimes there's conflicts between the subculture and the majority culture, which really makes an individual ask, well, which culture do I want to identify with and which culture do I want to be a part of? Mixed ethnicity individuals often face the greatest conflicts in choosing, but they do have stronger identification they do better if they really strongly identify with one group, as opposed to if they feel kind of constantly conflicted. Okay, another kind of shift. So we've talked about kind of our own individual's understanding, but this is the and others part of the chapter. So we're going to talk about how do we understand other people. And so in terms of understanding what other people are doing, by age 1, we start understanding that other people's actions are intentional and goal-directed. So people are doing things for a purpose. 18 months, we start recognizing simple social norms. So you start to kind of expect what is going to happen at certain times. And really by the end of the second year, they can describe scripts for social routine. So a script is kind of a mental representation of an event, and kind of how one should expect to behave. So Maggie is 21 months old, and she knows if we mention a birthday, she starts singing happy birthday, right? So she knows the expectation of what's going to happen at a birthday party. But young kids sometimes have some issues in kind of identifying how to take other people's perspectives. So you can pause the video, take a minute and read this. But the question is kind of how do we go from this very self-centered, yes, other people may have perspectives, but I don't care, the only one that matters is mine, to sharing and considering other people's perspectives and really taking those into consideration. One of the big kind of milestones in this is theory of mind. So theory of mind is children's understanding that people have mental states such as thoughts, beliefs, and desires that affect their own behavior. Okay, so understanding that other people have things going on in their minds that might be different than what you have. And it really allows kids to get beyond other people's observable actions and appearances and kind of respond to their unseen states. So a classic test of this is the false belief task, where you can kind of assess whether people can hold inaccurate beliefs. You understand the concept that people can hold inaccurate beliefs that can influence their conduct. So this figure right here shows an example. So you've got Max who puts his chocolate in the green cupboard. He goes outside to play. His mom comes in, moves the chocolate from the green to the blue cupboard while he's outside, and his mom leaves. Max comes back home and wants his chocolate, and the question is, where will he look for it? Now, as an adult, it's obvious Max left it in the green cupboard. That's where he's going to look. But a young child has a hard time separating what the child themselves knows is the truth, which is that the chocolate is in the blue cupboard, from what Max knows, which is the last he knew the chocolate was in the green cupboard. So that difficulty is problems with theory of mind. And generally we see kids achieve this by about 4 to 5 years old. I've got a video on Moodle of other false beliefs tasks that you can kind of watch to see how this works. But this is really foundational for all of later social cognitive development. Okay, so kids have to go through a number of processes before they get to theory of mind and beyond this. And so there's a number of different kind of levels of rationale that they might be able to engage in. From an egocentric perspective, they don't recognize that other people have their own thoughts or interpret experiences differently. The differentiated perspective is that kids realize that they may have either the same or different perspective from another person, but they have a hard time making judgments about the other person's perspective. As they get older, they can kind of see how other people see them and consider others' thoughts. Mutual perspectives, they can really take multiple different perspectives. And at stage 4, they can really kind of imagine points of view based on someone's political affiliation, for example. Okay, so in terms of what prompts perspective taking, there are certainly biological contributions, although that argument is somewhat kind of how much of a role biological contributions play is somewhat controversial. But there's also a lot of evidence for social influences as well. And basically, to develop a theory of mind, you have to participate in a community of minds to understand that other people have mental states. So, for example, family discussions really help us understand other people's minds. Kids who are in families who frequently talk about mental states are more likely to succeed in theory of mind tasks. So when parents ask kids opinions and explain how kids are feeling, these kinds of things help kids understand people's mental states. Also, having siblings increases the age or makes kids develop theory of mind earlier. So when siblings play together, they engage in pretend play. They also have to resolve disputes, which goes really far for helping other people see perspectives. They share concerns and goals. And also secure attachment generally to parents also increases these kinds of discussions. There's also some interesting cultural differences here where some tribes and some cultures that just don't talk as much about mental states, we see kids developing theory of mind much later. Another important component of this is just kind of how we label other people's traits. And so in preschoolers, they really, just like they describe themselves in terms of physical characteristics, they focus on other people in terms of physical characteristics. But by the time we get to early childhood, they really understand other people's personal attributes, and that these personal attributes will predict how people will act. As they get to later childhood, kids can describe another person's actions less in terms of just generally good and bad, but in terms of stable psychological traits. And then in adolescence, they really understand the complexities of people. Okay, so one thing that kind of our judgments about other people can influence are stereotypes and prejudices. So a stereotype is kind of a label that we apply to an individual based on their membership in a group. And it tends to neglect the fact that people vary wildly within a group. So stereotype consciousness is the knowledge that other people have beliefs based on this ethic. Stereotypes are you just aware that other people are acting based on their own stereotypes. Prejudice is a set of attitudes by which an individual defines all members of a group negatively. So stereotype is kind of the general grouping of people, and prejudice is the negative attitude about them. We see prejudice is evident by age 5. We see an increase in early childhood. And again, we can kind of see it increasing as kids really focus on their own ethnic identity. In kind of early childhood, this looks like avoidance and social exclusion, but in late childhood and adolescence, sometimes prejudice can lead to conflict and hostility. So there's some evidence that we might be kind of biologically primed to have prejudice or to stereotype people. There are kind of certain brain activities that we can see in response to people of different races. But a lot of that is probably also kind of prompted by social learning and social factors. So a lot of times kids get prejudice messages from parents or peers or school. And so, parents' racial socialization begins really even before kids are 2. And that the kind of messages parents are giving kids that young predicts kids' attitudes at ages 3 and 4. And even if parents aren't explicitly sending kids these messages, they're often getting them through their peers and social media. So these messages are getting ingrained pretty early. In terms of things that increase social prejudice, when we have groups that are very distinct and where group activities are segregated, we're much more likely to develop prejudicial attitudes. But if we can increase contact with group members and also create shared goals and reduce competitiveness, these kinds of things can decrease social prejudice. So doing things like pointing out individual characteristics of different members of the group, so you stop making these assumptions about everyone in the group, and minimizing stereotypes in media can make a pretty big difference. Okay, so the final topic in this section is language, and so this is really just it's covered here because language is an important aspect of social development, and it allows us to describe our feelings and desires and opinions and is necessary for social contact. So in order to have a relationship with other people, we have to be able to communicate with them in some way. So communication generally starts with pre-verbal utterances, so cooing and babbling. First words happen around 10 to 15 months, and they're often kind of words that stand for people or objects or actions or events. Things that really help facilitate social communication are the things that kids say first. So it shows you the importance of this. Often these kind of early utterances are really driven by parents and parent responses. When we move kind of from words to sentences, we go from kind of holo phrases where a single word represents a complete thought. So saying teddy means give me the teddy bear. You don't have to say the whole sentence. To telegraphic speech is 2 or 3 word utterances that include only the words essential to convey the intent. So give teddy means give me my teddy bear. So pretty early on, once kids start learning words, they're able to put them together. In the 3rd year of life, sentences become more complex as they start to learn the rules more, and really by age 5, the fundamentals of grammar are really pretty well ingrained. Kids are also learning kind of the rules of engaging socially in language. These are called pragmatics. So things like you have to get the listener's attention before speaking. You have to be sensitive to the listener's feedback and adjust your speech. So by age 2, kids kind of learn that they need to engage their listener and respond to what the listener says. They adjust their speech to a situation and adjust their speech to children of different languages or different ages. The best example I can think of is when Thomas talks to Maggie. He gets his little teacher voice, which is very different than the way he talks to us. But you can tell that he's figured out he needs to talk to her in a different way to communicate. So preschoolers adjust speech when speaking to peers of different status, and they have limited conversations in groups or on the phone, things like that.